Rain hammered the Kansas plains like a curse. 300 cattle exploded toward a rotting fence line. A man hit the mud face first. Lantern dead, hooves closing in. Then a shape tore out of the dark. Not a horse, not any ordinary body. Two immense arms locked around him and hauled him clear in a single brutal motion. The fence cracked under impossible weight. The herd slammed into living muscle. That figure braced the last rail, back arched, breath tearing in the storm. Thunder, sheets of water, and through the roar of panicked animals, one question hung unanswered. Who runs toward a stampede just to save a stranger? The platform at Wheat Ridge Junction smelled like coal smoke and wet cedar that October, the way it always did, before the rains came down from the northwest and turned the county roads to soup. 4 years the depot had stood there. For years of freight cars and cattle pens and men shouting numbers at each other across the loading dock. Long enough for the paint to give up on the siding. Long enough for the town to stop noticing the station at all. Except on Fridays. On Fridays, Nathaniel Ashford noticed everything. He tied his horse to the post at 10 minutes to 4. Same post. Same knot, the one his father taught him, the one that wouldn't slip even if the horse decided to test it, which she never did because she'd learned the rhythm too. Whistle. Wait. Home. Some animals just know when a man needs them to be patient. He bought a platform ticket. 5 cents. Exact change always, because fumbling for coins in front of the ticket window felt like a kind of failure he wasn't willing to commit twice. Then he walked to the second bench from the East End. And he sat. And he waited for a train that was never bringing anyone back to him. 3 years. Say it slow and it sounds like nothing. 3 years. A phrase. A stretch of time you'd use to describe how long a fence needed mending, or how long since the well went dry on the North 40. But say it the way Nathaniel said it, in his own head, at 4 in the morning, staring at a ceiling he used to share, and it stretched out into something with teeth. 3 years since the fever. 3 years since he'd been 40 miles east at a cattle auction in Emporia, haggling over 3 cents a head like it mattered, like anything mattered, while at home his wife's temperature climbed past what a body could survive. 3 years since he got back too late to do anything, but hold her hand while it went cold. He didn't let himself think about that part on Fridays. Fridays were for the good version. Fridays were for the platform and the bench and the particular slant of light that came through the station eaves around 4 in the afternoon, because that was when Adeline used to arrive, when Adeline used to run. She always ran. The last 20 yards. Every single time. Walking's too slow, she told him once, laughing, breathless, her bonnet coming untied. Not when you've been sitting still for 3 hours, and there's finally something worth moving toward. He could still see it. Right there. That stretch of platform boards, gray and split, from years of boots and weather. If he closed his eyes, he could put her back on them. Running, arms out a little like she might need to catch herself, though she never did because he was always there to catch her instead. He didn't close his eyes on the bench, though, because if he closed his eyes, someone might see him do it. And Wheat Ridge Junction had already spent 3 years deciding not to ask him questions. He wasn't about to give them a reason to start. The town understood the shape of it, if not the details. A rancher, widower, 3 years running a 2,000-acre spread alone, that used to take 2 people to keep the books straight on because Adeline had the head for numbers and he had the back for work, and together that had been enough. Now he had neither. Some days. Some days he just had the arithmetic of loss and a ledger that didn't balance the way it used to. People in town knew all this the way small towns know things. Without being told. Without asking. Old Ezra Fenwick, who ran the feed store, always tipped his hat when Nathaniel rode past on Fridays, and never once asked where he was headed, though everyone within 12 miles knew exactly where he was headed. Mrs. Halloran, who ran the boarding house near the depot, kept a standing rule that nobody was to sit on the second bench from the East End on a Friday afternoon. Even travelers. Even when the platform was crowded and there wasn't another seat to be had. She'd steer them somewhere else, with the practiced ease of a woman who'd been managing other people's discomfort for 30 years. Not their business, she'd say if anyone asked. which nobody did, because that was the town's other rule, unspoken and iron. You let a grieving man keep his grief in whatever shape he needed it. Nathaniel appreciated that more than he ever said out loud. He also, if he was honest, and he tried to be, most days, at least with himself, knew it wasn't sustainable. A man couldn't live his whole life on the exhale of one Friday afternoon a week. He knew that the way he knew a fence line needed checking before winter. He knew it, and he ignored it because some truths are easier to carry if you set them down for 6 days out of 7. The eastbound came through at 4:12. It always had. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe ran a tight schedule, tighter than most lines out this far, and Nathaniel had built a small, private religion around those 12 minutes past 4. The distant whistle, the tremor in the rails you could feel through the bench boards before you could hear the engine. The black smoke rolling back over the cars like something alive, unspooling against a Kansas sky that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to rain. He watched every passenger step down, every single one. A drummer with a case full of samples, moving fast, already talking before his boots hit the platform. 2 women in traveling clothes, sisters by the look of them, arguing gently about a trunk. A man in a good coat, who tipped his hat to no one in particular, like he was practicing being important. Nathaniel watched each of them the way a man watches for one face in particular, which meant he watched them all carefully, thoroughly, and then let each one go without a flicker of what he was actually feeling. Because that was the ritual. That was the whole shape of it. He didn't expect Adeline to be on the train. He knew with the flat, unglamorous certainty of a man who'd watched a woman die in his arms, that she was never getting off that train again. But knowing didn't stop the watching. If anything, it made the watching more important. Because the watching wasn't about hope. Not anymore. It hadn't been about hope in a long time. It was about not letting the last image of her fade. That platform. That running. Those 20 yards. If he stopped watching, stopped sitting here every Friday and rebuilding the moment brick by brick, he was afraid, genuinely afraid, in the specific way a rancher who never admitted fear about anything could be afraid of exactly one thing, that the picture would start to blur. That someday he'd try to call up her face, running toward him, laughing, bonnet coming loose, and he wouldn't be able to see it clearly anymore. That was the thing nobody understood about grief 3 years in. It wasn't the missing that scared you. It was the forgetting. The last car pulled away. He sat a few minutes more, same as always, watching the tracks bend east around the low rise of hill, until they disappeared from view, that same vanishing point Adeline's train used to emerge from all those years ago, smoke first, then the black shape of the engine, then her. Then he put his hat back on. Then he rode home. Nobody in Wheat Ridge Junction asked him about it. This was the 4th October he'd done this. Nobody expected that to change. They were wrong. Though nobody, not Nathaniel, not the town, not even the woman who would end up changing it, could have said exactly when the shift started, because these things rarely announce themselves. They arrive sideways. They arrive disguised as something else entirely. They arrive sometimes on a freight platform, hauling crates twice the weight a normal person should be able to lift, while half the town stands around trying to decide whether to be afraid or ashamed of themselves for being afraid. Freya Lindqvist had been in Wheat Ridge Junction 11 days, when Nathaniel first laid eyes on her. He wasn't there for her, of course. He was there because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays meant picking up feed sacks that had come in on the freight, 40 of them, sorghum and cracked corn for the cattle he was trying to nurse, through what promised to be a hard winter. He'd brought the wagon, and he'd brought his own back, because that was the economy of a one-man operation. You didn't pay for muscle you already owned. He didn't need to bring his back that day, because someone else's back was already doing the work. She was standing on the loading dock with a feed sack over one shoulder, 100 pounds, easy, maybe more, like it weighed nothing. Like it was a shawl she'd thrown on against the morning chill. And she was tall. Not tall the way a tall man is tall. Tall in a way that rearranged the geometry of the whole platform around her, so that the freight agent standing near her, a man Nathaniel knew to be over 6 feet himself, looked like he was standing next to a doorframe built for someone twice his size. She moved like the weight didn't register. Like her body had simply never learned that 100 pounds was supposed to be difficult. Nathaniel stopped his wagon a good 20 feet back, and just watched for a moment the way anyone would. Not out of judgment. Out of the plain animal instinct to understand what you were looking at before you got closer to it. What he saw mostly was a woman working hard and working well, doing a job that would have taken 2 men most of the morning, doing it alone, doing it before noon. What the rest of the platform saw, he'd learn soon enough, was something else. "Lord above," said a voice near Nathaniel's wagon wheel. Silas Deer, who ran the mercantile, and had opinions about everything whether anyone asked for them or not. "You seen the size of that woman?" "Seen her," Nathaniel said. Not much else to say. "Freight agent hired her on account of Tobias Whitmer breaking his hand," Silas said, warming to it now, the way men like Silas warm to any subject that let them talk without needing to be interrupted. "Said she showed up asking for work, and hefted a crate right there in front of him, that it'd have taken Tobias and his brother both to move. Man about fell over himself hiring her on the spot." "Good for her," Nathaniel said. "Good for her," Silas repeated, like the phrase tasted strange in his mouth. "That's one way to put it. Wife of mine won't let the children near the depot till she's sure what she's dealing with. Some kind of, I don't know what you'd call it. Affliction, I suppose." Nathaniel didn't answer that. Partly because he had nothing to say, that wouldn't come out sharper than he intended. Partly because he was still watching her work, and there was something in the watching that had quietly stopped being about the feed sacks. She set the 100-pound sack down with more care than the weight required. Straightened. Wiped her palms on her trousers. She wore trousers, practical ones, the kind a man would wear for hauling freight, and nobody on that platform seemed capable of looking at that fact without also looking like they'd bitten into something sour. She was younger than he'd first guessed. 30, maybe. Fair hair pulled back hard enough to mean business. A face that would have been called handsome on a smaller woman, and was instead being called, behind her back and not quietly enough, a great many other things. She didn't seem to hear any of it. Or she'd gotten good at not seeming to. Nathaniel had spent 3 years learning the particular skill of appearing unaffected by things that were, in fact, affecting him considerably. He recognized the same skill in someone else the way you recognize a scar from an injury you've had yourself. "You need help with that feed?" the freight agent called over to him, breaking the moment. Nathaniel climbed down from the wagon. "I can manage." "She could have it loaded faster and you'd manage in an hour," the agent said, nodding toward Freya, half joking, half not, in the way men talk about strength like it's a competition even when nobody's competing. Freya looked up then. First time she'd looked at Nathaniel directly. Gray eyes. Steady. The kind of steady that had clearly been built rather than born. The deliberate calm of someone who'd learned that flinching in public cost more than it was worth. "I don't mind helping," she said. Her voice carried a faint edge of something northern. Scandinavian, maybe, softened by years somewhere flatter, and drier than wherever she'd started. 40 sacks is a lot for one man and one wagon. It wasn't an offer made shyly. It also wasn't made with any particular expectation of being accepted. Nathaniel considered it for exactly as long as it took to glance at his own wagon bed, half empty, and the sun already climbing toward noon, and the long list of things waiting for him back at the ranch that had nothing to do with pride. "Obliged," he said. "Name's Nathaniel Ashford. Freya Lindqvist." She didn't offer a hand. He didn't reach for one. There was something in the way she held herself, not cold exactly, but braced like a person who'd learned that most first meetings ended with somebody staring too long or stepping back too far, that told him a handshake wasn't the gesture that would matter here. So instead he just nodded toward the sacks. "However you want to do it," and she picked up 2 at once. They loaded the wagon together, mostly in silence, though it wasn't an uncomfortable one. Nathaniel had spent 3 years learning to be comfortable in silence. It turned out to be a language some people simply spoke. Freya worked fast, efficient, unshowy despite what her strength should have made showy. She didn't grunt or strain or make any of the performances men sometimes made when they wanted witnesses to their effort. She just moved weight from one place to another like it was a fact of the world rather than an accomplishment. Halfway through, Nathaniel caught himself watching her hands, not for any reason he could have named out loud. Just the size of them, sure, larger than his own by a fair margin, but also the way they handled the burlap sacks. Careful at the seams. Like she'd learned somewhere that things could tear if you didn't respect them, and had decided not to let that happen twice. "You're new to the county," he said, mostly to fill the space, though he already knew the answer. 11 days, she said. "Where from?" A pause. Not long, but present. The kind of pause that told him this question had been asked before, and answered before, and hadn't always gone well. "East of here," she said. "Does it matter where exactly?" "No," he said. "Honestly, was just talk." She looked at him then, really looked, the way she hadn't quite done before, like she was recalibrating something. Like his answer had scored a point in a game he didn't know they were playing. "Most people ask because they're trying to decide something about me before I've said 3 words," she said. "Where I'm from, what happened there, whether I ought to be somewhere else instead." Nathaniel set down the sack he was carrying, took his time about it, straightened up. "I asked because I was making conversation," he said. "But I take your meaning." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile. The idea of one maybe still deciding whether it was safe to arrive. "Most folks don't take my meaning," she said. "Most folks don't try very hard to." "I've had some practice lately," Nathaniel said, "at being the thing folks talk around instead of to." He hadn't meant to say that much. It surprised him coming out of his own mouth, 3 years of careful silence, and here he was handing a stranger a piece of himself, over 40 sacks of sorghum feed, for no reason he could point to except that something about her steadiness made honesty feel less dangerous than usual. Freya didn't push at it, didn't ask what he meant, just nodded once, like she was filing it away, with the same care she'd used on the burlap seams. "Then we understand each other a little," she said. "That's more than I expected." From Wheat Ridge Junction in 11 days. They finished loading. Nathaniel offered her 50 cents for her trouble. Fair wage for an hour's hard work. Maybe generous, though it didn't feel like enough for what she'd actually given him, which was harder to put a price on. She almost refused it. He could see the refusal forming, some old pride rising up behind her eyes. Then she took it instead, and something about the way she folded the coin into her palm told him refusing hadn't always been an option she could afford. That taking help, taking payment, taking anything offered plainly, and without conditions, that this was its own kind of rare for her. "Obliged," he said again, echoing his earlier word, and this time it meant something different. "You're the rancher," she said. "Not a question. The one who comes to the depot on Fridays." Nathaniel went still, just for a second. Long enough that she noticed, because she was clearly a woman who noticed things had to be, probably, to survive being looked at the way she got looked at every day, everywhere she went. "Word travels," he said. "Careful now. The old guard going back up." "Mrs. Halloran mentioned it," Freya said. "Said not to take the second bench from the East End on a Friday afternoon. Didn't say why. Said it wasn't her business to say, and it wasn't mine to ask." "She'd be right about that. I didn't ask," Freya said. "For what that's worth." It was worth something. He wasn't sure yet how much. "Obliged," he said for the 3rd time, and this time he heard himself say it, and felt the word start to wear thin from overuse, the way a man's vocabulary does, when he spent 3 years mostly talking to cattle and horses and the inside of his own head. Freya almost smiled again. This time it nearly arrived. "You say that a lot," she said. "I don't get much practice with other words. Might want to work on that," she said, and there was something almost warm buried in it. Something that didn't match the careful, braced way she'd held herself all morning. Small towns notice a man who's only got one word. Then she turned, hefted the last sack like it weighed nothing, and carried it toward the depot storeroom, without waiting to see whether he had a reply. He didn't, as it happened. Not one worth saying out loud. But he thought about her the whole ride home. Thought about her hands on the burlap seams. Thought about the particular way she'd said Mrs. Halloran told me not to take the second bench, without a trace of mockery in it. Like she understood exactly what kind of grief needed a bench of its own, and wasn't about to begrudge a stranger that. He hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected anyone in this county to look at him the way she'd looked at him. Not with pity, not with the careful, managed distance the town had learned to keep, but with something closer to recognition. He didn't examine that feeling too closely. Fridays were 3 days off. He had a ranch to run, and a herd to worry over, and a winter coming on faster than the feed supply could keep pace with. He told himself that was reason enough not to think about a woman with gray eyes and careful hands. It wasn't, but it was reason enough to try. The rest of that week the town did what towns do. It talked. Nathaniel heard fragments of it wherever he went: the mercantile, the blacksmiths, the low murmur of men gathered outside the saloon at dusk, not drinking so much as loitering, the way men in small towns loiter when they've decided a subject is worth chewing over slowly. Some of what he heard was cruel, genuinely cruel, the kind of talk that made his jaw tighten even when it wasn't aimed at him. Big as a barn door, someone said. Ought to be in one of them traveling shows, someone else said. Like her size made her a spectacle rather than a person. Like the size of a body was an invitation rather than simply a fact of how she'd been built. Not natural, said an older woman outside the church one Sunday. Loud enough that Nathaniel, passing on his way to the feed store, heard every word of it, and felt something cold and unfamiliar climb up the back of his neck. Some of what he heard was gentler, though not by much. Poor thing, wrapped around a tone that suggested Freya was a burden to be pitied rather than a woman to be respected. Must be hard on her, finding work, finding a place, finding anybody willing to, and there the sentence would trail off unfinished because nobody quite wanted to say out loud the thing they were all clearly thinking. Nathaniel found himself more than once that week on the verge of saying something, correcting someone, telling Silas Deer, specifically, to mind his own business the way the whole town had been minding Nathaniel's for 3 years running. He didn't, though, not yet, because saying something meant admitting he'd been thinking about her. And admitting that felt that week like more than he was ready to hand over, not to the town and not entirely to himself either. Thursday night he couldn't sleep. This wasn't unusual, exactly. Sleep had been an unreliable companion since the fever took Adeline, showing up some nights in full and generous measure, and abandoning him completely on others, with no pattern he'd ever managed to predict. But this particular sleeplessness had a different shape to it. He lay in the bed that used to be theirs, still thought of it that way 3 years on, theirs though it had been his alone for longer now than it had ever been shared, and he found his mind circling back again and again to a loading dock and a woman lifting feed sacks like they weighed nothing. He got up eventually, lit the lamp, sat at the small desk in the front room, where Adeline used to keep the account books, where he still kept them in her hand, mostly her old entries, because he'd never had the heart to start a fresh ledger and leave hers behind on a shelf like something finished. He opened the ledger that night. Not to work the numbers, those he already knew too well, knew them the way you know a wound, by heart and against your will. He opened it because it was a way of being close to her, without the specific, unbearable weight of the bench of Fridays of watching a train arrive and leave. Her handwriting filled the pages. Careful, precise. Numbers that added up because she'd made sure of it every week, sitting right here where he was sitting now. He remembered her voice from those evenings, remembered it with a clarity that startled him even after 3 years, the way certain memories stayed sharp, while others blurred no matter how hard he tried to hold them. We're short again this month, Nathaniel. But we'll manage it. We always manage it. He'd believed her back then. Believed her the easy, unquestioning way you believe someone who has never once been wrong about something that mattered. Now the ledger sat mostly empty of her voice, filled instead with his own cramped, functional numbers, and he did the accounts alone, and he managed it mostly, but managing it alone felt different than she'd made it sound. Felt heavier. Felt like a thing you did instead of a thing you shared. He thought that night, staring at her old handwriting by lamplight, about a woman on a loading dock who hadn't flinched away from his silence, who'd said something in return that felt like it cost her something to say. He thought, it's been 3 years. He thought, that doesn't mean anything has to change. He thought that second thought harder than the first, like repetition might make it more true. It didn't particularly, but it got him back to bed, and eventually it got him a few hours of sleep, And in the morning there was a ranch to run, same as every morning, and a Friday coming, same as every week. Friday arrived the way Fridays always did in October. Cool in the morning, warmer by afternoon. The light doing that particular slantwise thing that made even ordinary Kansas grassland look like something worth a second glance. Nathaniel did his morning chores, with the same care he always did. Fed the stock. Checked the water troughs because a rancher who let his water freeze over in the coming months, even a light freeze, was a rancher asking for trouble. Rode the near pasture to count heads because counting heads was how you noticed trouble before it became a crisis instead of after. 300 head, give or take. Decent land. 15 years of building this operation, from nothing much, first with his father's help, and then, after his father passed, with Adeline's, her mind for the numbers making up for what his back alone couldn't manage. Together they'd turned a modest spread into something that could actually support 2 people, and then, cruelly, only 1. He didn't let himself dwell on that count the way he usually didn't. 300 head sounded solid, until you remembered what a single hard winter could do to a herd not properly fed, not properly sheltered, not properly managed by 2 sets of capable hands instead of 1 increasingly tired pair. By 3:30 he was in his good shirt. The blue one. Adeline had always liked it on him, said it matched something in his eyes, though he'd never quite understood women's talk about matching eyes to shirts, and had loved her enough not to argue the point. He checked the south fence line on his way into town the way he sometimes did and found nothing growing there worth cutting for her. The wildflowers had mostly gone by, this late in the season, just a few stubborn stalks holding on against the coming frost. He took what there was. Not much. A small, ragged handful. Felt right anyway. It always did. He tied his horse at the post. 10 minutes to 4. Same knot. He bought his platform ticket from the window, and it wasn't the regular clerk behind the glass. The regular clerk had taken ill that week, word was, and the freight agent had pulled someone in to cover ticket sales along with the loading dock work. It was Freya. Nathaniel stopped mid-motion, coin already halfway across the counter, and for a moment neither of them said anything. She looked different behind the glass. Not smaller exactly, nothing could have made her look smaller, but softer somehow, in a plain gray dress instead of trousers, her hair pulled back the same practical way, but catching the afternoon light differently now, gold instead of just fair. "Mr. Ashford," she said, formal, careful, like she'd rehearsed the neutrality of it. "Miss Lindqvist." He matched her tone mostly, though something in his chest had gone unexpectedly loud. "Platform ticket," she said, not a question. She already had it in her hand, already sliding it across the counter, before he'd fully asked. 5 cents, he said, sliding the coin to match. "I know the fare," she said, and there it was, the almost smile again, quicker this time, gone almost before it arrived. "You've been buying the same ticket every Friday for 3 years. I imagine the whole depot knows the fare by now." He didn't answer that right away, didn't quite know how. "You don't have to explain it," she said, softer now, reading something in his silence. "Mrs. Halloran already told me not to ask. I'm not asking." "I know," he said. "I appreciate that." He took the ticket. Their fingers didn't quite touch, though he was aware, acutely, uncomfortably aware of how close they came. He turned to go, made it 2 steps toward the bench, before her voice stopped him. "Mr. Ashford." He turned back. "The flowers," she said, nodding toward the small, ragged bundle in his hand, the last of the season's wildflowers, wilting slightly now from the ride into town. "There for someone." Not a question again. She seemed to prefer statements to questions, maybe because questions in her experience so often turned into weapons, and statements at least let the other person decide how much to answer. "They were," he said, present tense catching, correcting itself. "Are, I don't know which. Both, maybe." Something crossed her face then, not pity, which he'd braced for, which he'd have hated, but something closer to understanding. The specific, hard-won understanding of someone who'd also lost people, and also hadn't quite settled on the correct tense for talking about them. "My mother used to say," she said slowly, like she was choosing the words with unusual care, "that love doesn't change tense just because the person's gone. It just gets harder to conjugate. Nathaniel felt something in his chest do something complicated. Something he hadn't felt in 3 years, or hadn't let himself feel, or hadn't recognized, because it had been so long since he'd had reason to. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," he said. "She was," Freya said. "She's gone too. Both my parents. Winter before last." "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said, and meant it entirely, the way you only mean condolences, when you understand exactly what they're worth, and exactly how insufficient they are. "So am I," Freya said. "Some days more than others." They stood there a moment, the ticket window between them, two strangers who'd each buried people that mattered and hadn't quite figured out what to do with the space left behind. "You should go," she said finally, nodding toward the platform, toward the bench, toward the ritual he'd built his grief around. "It's nearly 4. He glanced at the depot clock. 6 minutes to. "Thank you," he said, "for the ticket." "It's 5 cents, she said. "Standard fare." But something in the way she said it told him she wasn't only talking about the ticket. He sat on the bench. The wildflowers rested beside him, small and wilting and honest in a way that felt right for October, for the tail end of a season, for a love that had also entered whatever its own equivalent of late autumn was. The eastbound came in at 4:12, same as always. He watched the passengers step down, same as always, a family, a drummer, an elderly couple moving slow and careful down the steps, helped along by a porter who clearly knew them from previous trips. He watched every face, same as always. None of them were Adeline, same as always. But something was different this Friday, and it took him most of the 12 minutes the train sat at the platform to identify what it was. He could feel Freya watching him, not obviously, not in a way that would have embarrassed either of them. She'd gone back to her ticket window duties, was helping a passenger with a connection schedule, was doing the ordinary work of a depot clerk on an ordinary Friday afternoon. But every so often, he could feel it more than see it, the particular prickle of attention that a person develops after enough years of being watched or of watching her eyes would find him. Brief, careful, not intrusive, just present. It wasn't pity in that attention. He'd have recognized pity. He'd had 3 years of the town's careful, managed pity to compare it against, and this was something else entirely. Felt, if he had to name it, like company, like being witnessed instead of merely tolerated. He hadn't realized until that Friday how much of a difference there was between the two. The train pulled away. He sat his usual few minutes more, watching the tracks curve east around the low rise and vanish, same vanishing point Adeline used to emerge from all those years ago. Then he stood, put his hat on. He didn't walk straight to his horse, though. He found himself walking, instead, back toward the ticket window, the wilted wildflowers still in his hand, though he couldn't have said exactly what he meant to do with them or say when he got there. Freya looked up as he approached. Something wary crossed her face for half a second, old habit, probably, the reflexive bracing of someone used to unwanted attention, before it settled into something more open. "Forget something, Mr. Ashford?" He looked down at the flowers, then back at her. "These were for the bench," he said. "I usually leave them there, but they've mostly gone to wilting, and I thought—" He stopped, not sure what he'd thought exactly, now that he was standing here trying to say it out loud. Freya waited. She was good at waiting, he was noticing. Good at not filling silence just because silence made other people uncomfortable. "I thought you might like them," he finally said. "Since you're new here, might be nice to have something growing, even wilting on a windowsill. Winters get long in this county." It wasn't much of a gift. A handful of half-dead wildflowers, offered awkwardly across a ticket counter by a man who hadn't given anyone flowers in 3 years except a bench that couldn't receive them. But Freya took them like they mattered, held them careful, the same care she'd shown the burlap seams. Like things could break if you didn't respect them. "Thank you," she said, quiet, genuine. "Nobody's given me flowers in—" She paused, calculating, and something in the pause told him the number wasn't a small one. "Longer than I'd like to admit." Well, Nathaniel said, feeling suddenly strangely young, the way you feel young when you've said something that mattered and aren't quite sure, yet whether it landed the way you hoped. Now somebody has. He tipped his hat, turned to go. Mr. Ashford. He turned back. Same time next Friday? She asked, and there was something underneath the question, not forward, not presumptuous, just honest, that told him she wasn't only asking about the train. Same time, he said. Next Friday. He rode home, that evening, with something loosened in his chest, that had been knotted tight for 3 years. He didn't examine it too closely. He'd learned, in 3 years of careful grief, that some things went brittle if you looked at them too hard, too fast. But he thought about gray eyes and careful hands the whole way home, and for the first time in longer than he could easily count, the thought didn't feel like a betrayal of anything. Felt instead like breathing after holding it too long. The dream came that night. It came sometimes, though less often than it used to. Adeline, in the kitchen, she'd organized down to the last jar and shelf, saying something he could never quite hear clearly, the words dissolving the way dream words always did, leaving behind only the shape of her voice and the certain knowledge that whatever she'd said, it had been kind. He woke before dawn, the way he always did, after that particular dream, and lay still for a long moment in the gray half-light, listening to the house settle around him. He thought about the flowers, about gray eyes across a ticket counter, about a woman who'd said love doesn't change tense, it just gets harder to conjugate, and had clearly meant every word of it because she was conjugating her own losses the exact same difficult way. He thought, I am not betraying anything. He thought it firmly, deliberately, the way you think a thing you're not entirely sure of yet, hoping the conviction in your own head might eventually catch up to the words. Then he got up and fed the stock and started another week, because that was what a rancher did, grief or no grief, however his heart was busy sorting itself out behind the scenes. He didn't know, yet, that the week ahead would bring a storm. He didn't know, yet, that the storm would change everything. The clouds started building on Tuesday, high and slate-colored, moving in off the plains, with the particular heaviness that told anyone who'd ranched this county more than a season that trouble was coming. Nathaniel watched them, from the south pasture, counting head, feeling an old unease settle into his shoulders alongside the wind. 300 head, not sheltered enough for a real storm, not if it turned bad. He spent Wednesday and Thursday shoring up what fence he could, moving what stock he could closer to the barn, doing the frantic, insufficient work of a man trying to prepare in 3 days for something that should have taken 3 weeks. His foreman had quit that spring, gone west chasing better wages, and he hadn't found anyone to replace him yet, hadn't had the money to, not with the accounts running, as tight as they'd been running, since the herd started showing early signs of the lung sickness moving through the county. He was, if he let himself think about it plainly, running this ranch on the ragged edge of what one man alone could manage. He didn't let himself think about it plainly. Not often. Not if he could help it. Friday came, and with it, the first real bands of rain. Not yet the storm proper, just its outrider, testing the ground, testing the fences, testing him. He almost didn't go to the depot that day. Stood in his kitchen at 3:30, rain drumming the roof, and told himself a man would be a fool to ride 4 miles into town in weather like this for a ritual that didn't require him to actually be there. Then he thought of gray eyes across a ticket counter and found himself saddling his horse anyway. Freya was there when he arrived, soaked through despite the depot's awning, helping a stranded passenger, with a delayed connection, her voice steady and reassuring even, as the rain picked up around them. She caught sight of him coming, through the downpour, and something in her face, relief maybe or its close cousin, flickered before she covered it, with the same practiced neutrality she wore around most of the town. You didn't have to come, she said, once the passenger had been sorted and sent toward shelter. Not in this. Wouldn't feel right missing it, Nathaniel said, rain running off his hat brim in a steady stream. Even in weather like this. Even for a train that isn't bringing anyone? It wasn't cruel the way she said it. It was gentle, actually gentle and honest, the way only someone who understood grief from the inside could be gentle about someone else's. Especially then, he said. She studied him a moment, rain hammering the depot roof between them, and something passed across her face that he couldn't quite name, recognition maybe of a particular kind of stubbornness she recognized, because she carried her own version of it. The eastbound's running late, she said. Storms slowed the line east of here. Might be 20 minutes, might be an hour. I'll wait, Nathaniel said. Simple. Certain. I know, Freya said. I didn't think you'd do anything else. He waited on the bench, soaked through his good shirt, the blue one Adeline always liked, rain running down his collar in a way that would have made her fuss over him something fierce if she'd still been around to fuss. Freya brought him coffee at some point. He didn't see her leave to make it, didn't see her return, just became aware, somewhere in the gray stretch of waiting, of a tin cup pressed into his hands, steam rising off it into the cold rain. You'll catch your death, she said, sitting down beside him without asking, the bench groaning slightly under weight it wasn't built for, though it held the way old cedar sometimes surprised you by holding. Wouldn't be the worst way to go, he said. Waiting on a train. That's a grim joke, Mr. Ashford. Grim company some days. She didn't argue that. Didn't try to talk him out of his own grief the way so many well-meaning people had tried, over 3 years, to talk him into feeling something more convenient for everyone around him. She just sat there, in the rain, and let him be exactly as sad as he was. The eastbound finally came, through at 5:30, over an hour late, running slow through the storm, its headlamp cutting a weak yellow beam through the downpour. Nathaniel watched the passengers step down, fewer than usual, the weather having clearly discouraged some travel, and none of them, of course, were Adeline. He sat his usual few minutes after, watching the tracks disappear east, into rain and gathering dark, and Freya sat beside him the whole time, not speaking, just present, her shoulder close enough to his, that he could feel the warmth of her, through 2 layers of soaked wool. Thank you, he finally said, when the light had gone gray enough, that staying longer stopped making sense. For the coffee. He gestured vaguely, at the whole of it, the waiting, the company, the not asking. Somebody should sit with a person on the hard days, Freya said. I know what it costs doing it alone. He looked at her then, really looked, rain running down both their faces, and felt something shift in his chest that felt less like breaking and more like the exact opposite. Like something long broken finally being handled with the care it needed. You should get home before this gets worse, he said, though he didn't entirely mean it, didn't entirely want the moment to end. So should you, she said. Storm's not finished. I can feel it in the air. She was right. He should have listened harder to that particular warning. He rode home slow, careful, the rain coming down in sheets now, that made the road nearly invisible past his horse's ears. By the time he reached the ranch, full dark had fallen, and the wind had picked up to something with real menace in it, the kind of wind that got into a herd's nerves and made them jumpy, unpredictable, dangerous to be near. He should have brought the cattle in closer before he left for town. He knew that the moment he heard them, because even over the wind, even over the drumming rain, he could hear them, the low, unsettled bawling of 300 head deciding, collectively, that something about this storm had crossed from uncomfortable into terrifying. He didn't wait to think it through. He grabbed a lantern, mounted back up despite a horse, and a body both exhausted, from the ride into town and back, and rode hard for the south pasture, where the herd was penned closest to the fence line, that had, he now realized, with a cold drop in his stomach, been the weakest section he'd shored up all week. He got there in time to see it start. Lightning cracked somewhere close enough that the flash and the thunder arrived almost together, close enough to rattle the ground under his horse's hooves, and the herd broke. All at once, the way herds do, 300 head of frightened animal, moving as one terrified mass, straight toward the weak section of fence, straight toward the open dark beyond it, and straight, he realized with a horror that froze his whole body for one useless second, toward the spot where his own horse had shied sideways, dumping him hard onto the mud, his lantern guttering out somewhere in the chaos. He tried to scramble up. Couldn't get his footing in the mud fast enough. Heard the fence give way somewhere close with a crack like a gunshot. Heard 300 head of panicked cattle turning. That break into a flood. Heard it all coming toward him in the dark, with a speed no man on foot could outrun. He thought in that last clear second before instinct took over entirely. This is how it ends. Not the fever, not the grief, just mud and dark, and a stampede he'd been too slow to prevent. Then something moved, through the dark beside him, fast, sure, impossibly strong, and a pair of hands closed around him, and hauled him bodily out of the path of the herd, up and back and clear in one motion, that shouldn't have been possible for anyone his own size, let alone anyone smaller. He hit the ground hard, several yards clear of, where he'd fallen, breath knocked out of him, and watched, from flat on his back in the mud, rain hammering his face, heart slamming against his ribs, as a shape he could barely make out in the dark, and downpour threw itself against the broken fence rail, one section still holding, and hauled it back into place with strength that made no physical sense, buying just enough time to turn the front of the herd, to break their headlong panic into something more like confusion, enough for them to mill instead of run. He lay there, gasping, rain in his eyes, and tried to make out a face in the dark and the chaos. He couldn't, just a shape, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a strength that seemed to belong to something out of an old story rather than an actual person standing in his actual south pasture on the worst night of the year. "Are you hurt?" A voice called over the wind, over the settling ball of the herd. A voice he thought, for one dizzy, mud-soaked second, he recognized. He started, trying to get his breath, trying to get his feet under him. "I'm all right, I think." "Who?" But by the time he'd gotten upright, swaying, soaked through, the shape was gone. Vanished into the storm as completely as it had appeared, leaving nothing behind but a section of fence rail hauled back, into place with more strength than should have been possible, and 300 head of cattle, shaken but no longer running, and a rancher standing alone in the mud, and the dark staring at the space where his rescuer had been. He didn't sleep that night, couldn't even after he'd gotten the herd fully settled, fully checked for injuries. Remarkably, nothing worse than a few scrapes among the cattle, nothing that wouldn't heal, and dragged himself, filthy and shaking, back into the house sometime past midnight. He sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing, replaying the moment over and over. The hands that had hauled him clear, the impossible strength that had turned 300 head of panicked cattle with a single fence rail. The voice, calling through the storm, "Are you hurt?" A voice that had sounded, in the chaos and the dark, and his own ringing ears, almost familiar. He thought of gray eyes across a ticket counter. He thought of hands that lifted 100-pound feed sacks like they weighed nothing at all. He told himself it couldn't be. He told himself that most of the night, actually, turning the coffee mug in his hands until it went cold, listening to the storm finally wear itself out against the roof. But some part of him, some part that had spent 3 years learning to notice small, careful, deliberate things about people, because that had become the only kind of noticing he trusted anymore, already knew. He just wasn't ready yet to say it out loud, not even to himself, not on a night when the only thing he was certain of was that someone, somewhere out there in that terrible storm, had chosen to save his life, without waiting to be thanked for it, without waiting to be seen. He thought about that as the first gray light of dawn started creeping through the kitchen window. About what kind of person did that, ran toward danger instead of away from it, for a man they barely knew, and then vanished before they could be recognized for it. He thought he might already know the answer. He thought come Friday he might finally have the nerve to ask. The Friday after the storm came in clear and cold, the kind of sharp blue Kansas sky that made a man forget, for a few hours anyway, that winter was coming for real this time. Nathaniel rode into Wheat Ridge Junction, with something sitting in his chest he hadn't carried in 3 years. Not grief, not exactly, something closer to a question. A question he'd turned over all week, in the barn, in the saddle, at 2 in the morning, when sleep wouldn't come, because he kept seeing it. The shape in the storm, the hands. The strength that shouldn't have been possible. And he kept hearing that voice. Are you hurt? He tied his horse at the post. Same knot. Except his hands weren't quite steady doing it, which hadn't happened in longer than he could remember. He bought his ticket. Freya was behind the glass again, the regular clerk still poorly. Word was some kind of chest cold that wouldn't quit, and she looked up at him with an expression that was almost neutral. Almost. Mr. Ashford, she said. Miss Lindqvist. Neither of them moved for a second. The depot went on around them. A porter hauling a trunk, a child's laugh. From somewhere down the platform, the ordinary machinery of an ordinary Friday. Except nothing about this felt ordinary. I heard, Freya said carefully, that your fence went down in the storm. That you lost some head to it. Didn't lose any, Nathaniel said, watching her hands, specifically, the way they'd gone very still on the counter. Fence broke. Herd ran. Somebody turned them before they got far. That's fortunate, Freya said. It is, he agreed. Whoever it was pulled a rail back into place with their bare hands. In the dark. In a storm that had half the county's stock spooked half to death. That does sound fortunate, Freya said again. Careful. Too careful. Strong person, Nathaniel said. Had to be. That rail weighed more than most men could manage even in good weather. Freya's jaw tightened, just slightly. I imagine so, she said. He set his coin on the counter. Didn't take the ticket. She slid toward him. Just looked at her, really looked, the way he'd been wanting to, since the storm, since he'd woken, that morning after, with mud dried into his collar, and a voice ringing in his ears that he couldn't quite place and couldn't quite forget. Freya, he said. First time he'd used her given name. Was it you? The question sat there between them. For a long moment she didn't answer. Just held his gaze, gray eyes steady. The same steadiness he'd noticed the very first day on the loading dock. Except this time there was something else underneath it. Something braced. Something that looked, if he had to name it, like fear. Does it matter? She finally said, It matters to me. Why? Because you saved my life. Because I want to thank the person who did it. Because I can't stop thinking about it. Because he didn't say any of that. Not yet. Not with a line forming behind him, and a whole depot's worth of ears, that didn't need this particular conversation. Because I don't like not knowing who I owe, he said instead. Freya studied him a long moment. Then, quiet, almost too quiet to hear, over the platform noise. You don't owe me anything. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. She turned away then, helped the next passenger in line. And Nathaniel stood there holding his ticket, understanding, with the particular sinking clarity of a man who's just watched a door close gently in his face, that he'd gotten his answer after all. He just hadn't gotten it in words. He didn't sit on the bench right away. He walked instead to the far end of the platform, where the loading dock met the depot proper, where he'd first watched her lift 100 pounds of feed like it was nothing at all. He stood there a moment, thinking, because it made sense once he let himself think it through properly. The strength, the size, the way she'd shown up at his ranch that night. No, wait, she hadn't shown up. She'd appeared, out of a storm, out of nowhere, and vanished the same way, before he could, so much as see her face clearly, which meant she'd been out there, in that storm, near his ranch, for reasons she hadn't offered, and he hadn't asked. He turned that thought over, turned it over again, didn't like where it kept landing, not because it frightened him, but because it made him wonder how long she'd been watching out for him, without his knowing it. He went back to the bench eventually. Saturday. Watched the 412 come in, same as always, and watched the passengers step down, same as always, none of them Adeline, same as always. But something had shifted. He could feel it. The ritual still held, the ticket, the bench, the watching, but it no longer felt like the entire shape of his week. For the first time in 3 years, there was something else pulling at his attention. Someone else. He didn't know yet what to do with that. He only knew it wasn't going away. She found him after the train pulled out. Came and sat beside him on the bench without asking, same as she had in the rain. And for A, while neither of them said anything at all. Then, it was me. Just that. Flat. Final. Like she'd decided, somewhere in the last hour, that the not saying had cost more than the saying would. Nathaniel didn't move. Didn't want to spook whatever this was. This fragile admission sitting between them on old cedar boards. I was riding back from the depot, she went on. Same as you. The storm caught me too. I saw the lightning. Heard the herd break before I saw it. And she stopped. Started again. I didn't think. I just went. You could have been killed. So could you. That's different. Is it? She turned to look at him, and there was something fierce in it now. Something that had clearly been waiting along, while for permission to come out. Why? Because I'm built different? Because whatever I am, whatever I look like to this whole county, makes me somehow less breakable than you. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant, she said, softer now, the fierceness ebbing, as fast as it had come. Everyone means it, even the kind ones. She's strong, so it doesn't count the same. She's strong, so it isn't really brave. It's just what she's built for. Nathaniel was quiet a moment, turning that over, understanding slowly that he'd very nearly made the same mistake as every other person in this county who looked at Freya Lindqvist and saw a fact of nature instead of a woman who'd made a choice. You ran toward a stampede in the dark, he said finally. To save a man you'd known 11 days. That's not what you're built for. That's who you are. Something in her face cracked open, just slightly. Nobody's ever put it that way before, she said. Then everybody else has been saying it wrong. They sat there a long while after that, watching the tracks, watching the light go gold, and then gray the way October light did, dropping fast once it started dropping. Why didn't you tell me? Nathaniel finally asked. That night, you could have stayed a minute. Let me thank you properly. Freya looked out at the tracks, not at him. Because I've learned, she said, that people thank me for the strength and then keep their distance from the rest of me. The size, the way I take up a doorway, the way children stare and mothers pull them close, and grown men decide, without knowing me at all, what kind of woman I must be to look the way I look. I'm not like that. You don't know that yet, she said, not unkind, just honest. Neither do I. Not really. 11 days, Mr. Ashford. That's all we've had. Nathaniel, he said, if we're going to keep saving each other's lives, you might as well use my given name. That earned him something close to a real laugh, short, surprised, like it had escaped, before she could decide whether to let it. Nathaniel, then, she said. Freya. The name sat comfortably in his mouth, more comfortably than he expected. Winter came on hard after that, the way it always did in this part of Kansas, not gradually, but all at once, like the season had been holding its breath and finally let go. Frost thick on the fence rails by the second week of November. Wind that cut through wool like it wasn't there. And every Friday, without fail, Nathaniel rode into Wheat Ridge Junction. The ritual changed shape without ever quite breaking. He still bought his ticket, still sat the bench, still watched every passenger step down off the 412, still watched the tracks curve east and vanish, still carried whatever grief the week had handed him out to, that same worn stretch of platform. But now there was tea waiting. Freya had taken to brewing something her mother used to make, dried lingonberry and some bitter northern herb Nathaniel couldn't name, steep strong, poured into a tin cup that fit awkward and warm into cold hands. She'd bring it out after the train pulled away, sit beside him without asking any more, because asking had stopped being necessary somewhere in the last few weeks. My mother made this every winter, she told him once, watching the steam rise off his cup, said it kept the cold from settling into your bones. I don't know if that's true, but it's warm, and it's something, and some days something is enough. It's good, Nathaniel said. Meant it. You say that about everything I make. Because it's true about everything you make. She'd fixed the depot awning by then, too, climbed up one Saturday with tools borrowed, from the blacksmith and reset 3 rotted support beams that the freight agent had been meaning to get to for the better part of a year. Did it in an afternoon, alone, work that would have taken 2 men most of a week. The town noticed. The town always noticed. Some of what they said got kinder, slowly, the way ice thins before it breaks. A few of the ranchers who'd needed help hauling winter feed started asking for her by name instead of just any hand available. Old Ezra Fenwick, gruff as ever, started saving her the good coffee beans instead of the dregs he sold to everyone else. But some of it stayed exactly as cold as it had been that first week. Colder, if anything, because now there was a rancher, a respected one, a widower everyone had long since decided to leave alone in his grief, spending every Friday afternoon on a bench beside her. That, it turned out, some people couldn't quite forgive. "You're aware," Silas Deere said one Tuesday, leaning against the mercantile counter, while Nathaniel counted out coins for winter supplies, "that folks are talking. Folks are always talking, Silas. About you and that Lindqvist woman." Nathaniel didn't look up from his counting. "Then folks ought to find better use of their time." "I'm just saying." Silas held up both hands, the universal gesture of a man about to say something he knew wasn't his business, and was going to say anyway. "Man in your position, well-regarded, respected widower, 3 years mourning proper, whole counties had nothing but sympathy for you. And now you're keeping company, regular company, with a woman who what, Silas?" Something in Nathaniel's voice must have carried more edge than he intended, because Silas actually stopped, actually reconsidered. "Nothing," Silas said. "Never mind." "No," Nathaniel said, setting the coins down harder than necessary. "Finish it. A woman who what?" Silas's jaw worked a moment. "A woman who isn't natural-sized. Nathaniel, you know what I mean. Folks wonder what kind of affliction makes a body grow like that. Wonder if it's catching. Wonder if it's a judgment. Wonder if she's a person," Nathaniel said flatly. "Instead of wondering about the size of her, that's the wondering you all ought to be doing." He picked up his supplies and left without waiting for a reply. He rode home that evening with his jaw still tight, and he thought, not for the first time, though with more force than before, that 3 years of the town's careful, respectful silence around his own grief had never once cost him anything. Had never once made him a target of speculation, or fear, or the particular cruelty that dressed itself up as concern. Freya had been in this county less than 2 months, and already she was carrying a weight he'd never had to carry at all. He didn't like what that told him about the difference between his grief and her existence. Late November brought the sickness proper, not the storm this time, but something worse, slower, meaner. It started with a cough, low and wet, moving through the herd like rumor moves, through a small town, quiet at first, and then everywhere all at once. Lung fever, the old-timers called it, the same killing cold moving down from the northern ranges that had already devastated herds clear up through Montana. Nathaniel had heard about it secondhand for weeks, a rancher near Ellsworth losing 40 head, another outside Salina losing 60, and had told himself, the way every rancher tells himself right up until it's too late, that his herd would be spared. It wasn't spared. He found the first 3 animals down in the south pasture on a Tuesday morning, breathing wrong, eyes gone glassy, and he knew, the way a rancher just knows in his gut, before the vet even confirms it, that this was the beginning of something that would cost him dearly before it finished. By the following week, he'd lost 11 head. He did the arithmetic that night at the kitchen table in the ledger that still carried Adeline's careful old handwriting alongside his own increasingly grim additions, and the numbers told him what he already knew in his bones. 11 head gone, more likely to follow, a winter's worth of feed already stretched thin. A note at the bank coming due in the spring that he'd been counting on a full herd to cover. He sat there a long time, staring at the numbers, feeling the particular hollow fear of a man watching 15 years of careful building start to slip through his hands. 15 years, and one piece of it had never once given him trouble in all that time, the spring on the northeast quarter, the parcel that had come down through Adeline's father, the one that never ran dry, not even in the drought summer of '81, when half the county was hauling water by the barrel. He thought of it that night only in passing, the way a man thinks of the one thing that's never worried him, while he's busy worrying about everything else. He had no reason yet to think of it any other way. He thought about Adeline, about the version of this conversation they used to have together at this same table, her steady voice cutting through his worry with actual numbers, actual plans, the way two people managing hard things together always found a path that one person alone couldn't quite see on his own. "We'll manage it," she used to say. "We always manage it." He wasn't so sure this time that he would. He didn't tell Freya that Friday. Didn't tell anyone, really, pride being what it was, and asking for help being a muscle he'd let atrophy, over 3 years of managing everything alone. But she noticed anyway. Of course she noticed. She'd gotten good, in 2 months, at reading the particular tightness that settled into his shoulders when something was wrong. "You're not yourself today," she said, settling beside him on the bench, after the 412 pulled away. "Long week," he said, which was true and also nowhere near the whole truth. Nathaniel, just his name, just enough weight in it to tell him she wasn't going to let this one go easy. He exhaled, long, slow, the kind of exhale that carries more than air. "Lost 11 head to the lung sickness," he said. "Been building since last week. Vet says it could spread through the whole herd if the cold snap doesn't break soon." "How bad, financially?" He looked at her, surprised, not by the question, but by the directness of it. Most people, hearing that kind of news, offered sympathy first, and practicality never. Freya went straight to the number that actually mattered. "Bad," he admitted. "Notes coming due at the bank in spring. Was counting on a full herd's worth of stock sales to cover it. Lose enough head between now and then I'll be short." "How short?" "Don't rightly know yet. Depends how many more I lose." Freya was quiet a moment, turning something over. "I've got some savings," she said finally. "Not much, but some. If it would help." "No." The word came out faster, and harder than he meant it to. He softened it immediately. "No, thank you, but that's not, I couldn't take that from you." "Why not?" "Because it's yours. Because you've worked hard for it. Because I'm not your wife," Freya said, quiet, not cruel, just naming the thing sitting under his refusal, the thing he hadn't quite let himself say out loud. "You'll let me sit beside you on this bench every Friday. You'll let me make you tea, and fix your depot awning, and pull you out of a stampede in the middle of a storm. But you won't let me help you when it actually costs something." Nathaniel didn't have a ready answer for that, because she was right and he knew she was right, and knowing it didn't make it any easier to hear. "I'll manage it," he said finally, which was what he always said, which was starting, even to his own ears, to sound less like confidence and more like habit. "I hope you do," Freya said. "But Nathaniel, you don't have to manage everything alone. Not anymore. Not if you don't want to." He looked at her a long moment, at the steadiness in her gray eyes, the same steadiness that had first caught his attention on a loading dock 2 months ago. Back when he'd thought, mistakenly, he now understood, that her strength was only the physical kind. "I don't know how to do it any other way," he said honestly. "Been doing it alone 3 years. Don't rightly remember how to do it different." "Then maybe," Freya said, "it's time to remember." The man arrived in Wheatridge Junction the 2nd week of December, on a Wednesday, off the westbound freight, wearing a coat too fine for a cattle county, and a smile too practiced to trust. Jonas Whitfield. Nathaniel had heard the name before, everyone in the county had, by reputation if not by acquaintance. A banker out of Topeka who'd spent the last several years quietly buying up notes on struggling ranches across 3 counties, waiting patiently for hard winters, and worse luck to do the rest of his work for him. He didn't foreclose outright, the stories said. He didn't need to. He simply waited, and offered, and waited some more, until desperate men signed papers they'd have refused in better years. He came to Nathaniel's ranch on a Thursday afternoon, uninvited, riding a horse too well groomed for the weather, and sat his saddle at the edge of the yard like a man surveying property he already considered his own. "Mr. Ashford," he said. Pleasant. Too pleasant. Fine operation you've got here. 300 head or thereabouts, before the sickness started thinning your numbers. 15 years of building. Your father's work and then yours and your late wife's, from what I understand. You understand a good deal about my business, Mr. Whitfield, Nathaniel said. For a man I've never met. I make it my business to understand things, Whitfield said. Your note comes due in April. Bank in Topeka holds it now, purchased it last month, along with several others in this county. I imagine you've heard. Nathaniel hadn't heard. Felt something cold drop through his stomach at hearing it now. What do you want, Mr. Whitfield? To help you, Mr. Ashford. Simply that. Whitfield's smile widened, and there was nothing warm in it at all. You're a man in a difficult position. Sickness in your herd. A note coming due that a bad winter's losses might make hard to cover. I'm prepared to offer generous terms. Extend the note. Reduce the interest. All I'd need in exchange is a small parcel, the northeast quarter section, the one bordering the rail spur. Land that's not doing you much good, as pasture anyway, from what I've seen. Good grazing, mind you, and I noticed it never seems to want for water, even in a dry summer. Odd thing to notice, I suppose. A banker's habit. Nathaniel filed that away without quite knowing why it snagged. A banker noticing water. Strange thing to remark on, for a man who'd never run a head of cattle in his life. He went very still, though, for a different reason. The northeast quarter. The land Adeline's father had left her, separate from the rest of the ranch, deeded specifically to her name in a document Nathaniel had never fully understood the particulars of, some old-fashioned arrangement meant to protect a daughter's inheritance, from a husband's debts, drawn up back, when Adeline's father still distrusted the whole institution of marriage on principle. That land's not mine to sell, Nathaniel said slowly. Never was. It was my wife's, deeded separate. Something flickered across Whitfield's face, brief, calculating, gone almost as fast as it arrived. Your late wife's, he corrected gently, which means it passes to her legal heir, which, absent other children, Mr. Ashford, would be you. That's not how the deed reads. Deeds can be complicated things, Whitfield said, especially older ones drawn up by a man who's, since passed, with language that doesn't always hold up, as clean as folks assume. I've had my attorneys look into it as it happens. There's ambiguity there. Ambiguity that could go either direction, depending on how a judge chose to read it. Ambiguity that I'd be very willing to resolve quietly, in your favor, in exchange for the parcel, and a fair price besides, if we could come to an understanding, before your note comes due. Nathaniel understood in that moment with the particular clarity that comes from finally seeing a threat dressed up as an offer, exactly what kind of man had just ridden onto his property. And if I refuse? Whitfield's smile didn't waver. Then I suppose we'll let the courts sort out the deed's ambiguity the slow way, which tends to be expensive, which tends to take years. Years during which, I imagine, that note at the bank will still be coming due, sickness or no sickness, court proceedings or no court proceedings. He gathered his reins, turned his well-groomed horse back toward the road. Think it over, Mr. Ashford, he said. I'll be in the county a while yet. No need to decide today. He rode off without waiting for a reply, and Nathaniel stood in his own yard a long time after, feeling the particular cold that has nothing to do with December weather settle into his chest. He told Freya that Friday, told her everything, the note, the deed, the ambiguity Whitfield claimed to have found, the offer wrapped around a threat like a knife wrapped in silk. She listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening slightly, as the story went on, until by the time he finished she looked like a woman holding something back, with real effort. He's lying, she said flatly, about the deed. Has to be. A father protecting his daughter's inheritance wouldn't leave that kind of hole in the language. Maybe not, Nathaniel said. But I don't have the money to fight it in court if he decides to push. Whitfield does. That's how men like him win, Freya. Not because they're right, because they can outlast anybody who is. Then don't fight it alone, Freya said. Steady. Certain. There's a land agent in Selena. Does honest work. My landlady's brother-in-law knows him. We could have him look over the deed properly, get an opinion from someone who isn't paid by Whitfield's bank. We, Nathaniel repeated, quiet, testing the word. We, Freya said and didn't blink. Something in Nathaniel's chest loosened, just slightly, for the first time since Whitfield had ridden into his yard. All right, he said. We, what neither of them knew, what Nathaniel wouldn't learn for weeks yet, not until the whole ugly shape of it had already done its damage, was that Jonas Whitfield had left Nathaniel's ranch that Thursday and ridden straight into town, where he'd spent the rest of the afternoon in quiet, unhurried conversation with anyone willing to listen. He was good at it, practiced, the particular skill of a man who'd built a career on knowing exactly which fears to feed and exactly how much feeding they required. He didn't say anything directly cruel about Freya. That would have been too obvious, too easy to trace back to him, if anyone thought to ask why a Topeka banker cared one way or another about a depot worker's reputation. Instead, he asked questions, innocent-sounding ones. Strange, isn't it, he said to Silas Deere over coffee at the Mercantile, how the sickness in Ashford's herd started right around the same time that Lindqvist woman arrived in the county. Not saying there's a connection, just an odd coincidence is all. Folks do talk about places she's passed through before. Strange things happening in her wake. He said something similar to Mrs. Halloran, phrased just carefully enough to sound like idle concern rather than deliberate poison. He said it to the freight agent, to the blacksmith, to anyone with an ear willing to hold still for it. He never said anything that could be traced back as a lie exactly. He simply planted questions in soil that had already been primed by months of quiet suspicion and unexamined fear to grow exactly the kind of weeds he wanted. By the following week, the whispers had changed shape. They weren't just about her size anymore. They were about her arrival, her timing, the sickness that had started spreading through the county's herds not long after she'd shown up, the storm that had broken Nathaniel's fence. Hadn't she been out riding that night too, alone, unaccounted for, right around when the trouble started? Nobody said it outright. Small towns rarely do, when the accusation is ugly enough to require deniability. But the shape of it built anyway, whisper by careful whisper, until by the third week of December it had become something almost solid. Something dangerous. Nathaniel felt the shift before he understood its cause. It showed in small things at first. A rancher who'd usually nod to him warm and easy in town now offering something curter instead. A conversation at the feed store that went quiet abruptly when he walked in, the particular uncomfortable silence of people who've been talking about you and don't want you to know it. He asked Freya about it one bitter cold Friday in the third week of December and watched her face do something careful and controlled that told him she'd noticed it too. Had noticed it longer than he had, probably, and hadn't said anything because saying it out loud made it more real. People are saying things, she admitted finally, about the sickness in your herd, about the storm, about, she stopped, started again harder, about me being some kind of bad luck, some kind of judgment walking around on two legs. That's not, Nathaniel started. I know it's not true, Freya said, sharper than he'd ever heard her. I know exactly what I am and exactly what I'm not, Nathaniel. That's never been the problem. The problem is that it doesn't matter what's true. It only matters what people decide to believe. She was shaking, he realized, not from cold. I've seen this before, she said, quieter now, and there was something old and exhausted in it. Something that told him this wasn't the first town, the first county, the first careful whisper campaign she'd had to weather. Last place I lived, before I came here, something went wrong, a barn fire, nothing to do with me at all, and it didn't take but 2 weeks for half the town to decide I'd had a hand in it. Because I was different, because different is easy to blame. What happened? I left, she said simply, before it got worse. Before somebody decided talking wasn't satisfying enough anymore. Nathaniel felt something cold and furious rise in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced, with this much force and longer than he could remember. "That's not going to happen here," he said. "I won't let it." Freya looked at him, really looked, the particular searching look of someone who's heard that promise before and watched it fail to hold. "You can't control what a whole town decides to believe, Nathaniel," she said. "Nobody can." "Maybe not," he said, "but I can decide what I believe, and I can say it loud enough that anybody listening knows exactly where I stand." He didn't get the chance to prove it right away, though, because 3 days later the situation got considerably worse. Someone tore down the fence along the north boundary of the Ashford Ranch, a clean, deliberate break, not storm damage, not the accident it was meant to look like. And in the frozen mud near the break, pressed deep and unmistakable, were footprints. Enormous ones, far larger than any boot Nathaniel had ever seen, larger than seemed possible for any person to leave. His hired man found them first on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon half the county had heard about it, the story growing, with every telling the way stories always do. The giant depot woman had come out to Ashford's ranch in the dead of night and torn down his fence with her bare hands, maybe to finish what the sickness in his herd had started. Maybe just because that's the kind of thing folks decided a woman that size was capable of, when nobody was there to see her do it. Nathaniel rode out to examine the tracks himself the moment he heard. He crouched in the frozen mud a long while, studying them, something uneasy building in his gut that had nothing to do with the cold, because the prints were wrong, too uniform, too deep in some spots and too shallow in others, in a pattern that didn't match how weight actually distributed when a person walked. He'd hunted enough, tracked enough animals across enough seasons to know the difference between a real trail and one that had been pressed into the ground deliberately by someone carrying something heavy and shaped, stamping it down hard and moving on. Somebody had faked this. He didn't have proof yet, didn't have a name to put to it, though a name was already forming in the back of his mind, unwelcome and increasingly certain. What he had was a fence torn down 3 days after Jonas Whitfield rode off his property, with a threat wrapped in silk and footprints that looked less like evidence and more like a story somebody wanted the county to believe. He rode into town that afternoon to say exactly that. He was too late. The town meeting had already been called by the time he reached Wheatridge Junction, hastily organized in the church hall, the kind of meeting that happens when fear moves faster than good sense, when enough people decide together that something must be done, before anyone stopped to ask whether the something makes any sense at all. He pushed through the door in time to hear the tail end of it. Silas Deere, red-faced, gesturing. Somebody else, the blacksmith, maybe, nodding along hard. And near the front, calm as still water, offering nothing that could be traced back to him directly, Jonas Whitfield, sitting with his hands folded, listening. "Not saying we run her out," Silas was saying, though the crowd's mood suggested plenty of people were saying exactly that or close enough. "Just saying maybe it's not safe, having someone that size, that strange, wandering around loose at night doing Lord knows what to honest folks' property." "She's not wandering around doing anything," Nathaniel said, loud enough to turn every head in the room. The crowd went quiet. Whitfield's calm expression flickered, just slightly, at the sight of him. "Mr. Ashford," Silas said, recovering first. "This concerns your own property. Figured you'd want to say." "I do want to say," Nathaniel said, walking forward until he stood at the front of the hall, facing the whole gathered weight of the town's fear. "Those tracks on my land are fake, pressed into the mud by somebody who wanted this exact meeting to happen. I've tracked enough animals in 15 years to know a real trail from a staged one, and those prints were staged." "That's a mighty convenient thing to say," someone called from the back, "seeing as you're keeping such close company with her." Nathaniel found the voice. A rancher named Purdy, one he'd never had much quarrel with before tonight. "I'm keeping close company with her," Nathaniel said, "because she pulled me out of a stampede with her bare hands during that same storm everybody wants to blame her for. Because she's fixed the depot awning for free, hauled feed for half this county at fair wages, and hasn't once, in 2 months, given a single person in this room a real reason to fear her. The only thing she's guilty of is being built different than the rest of us. And I'd have thought, in a town that spent 3 years respecting a man's grief, without a single question asked, we'd have learned something about minding our own hearts before we go deciding somebody else's fate. The room was very quiet. He caught Whitfield's eye across the hall, just for a second, and saw something there, not fear exactly but recalculation. The look of a man whose plan had just hit an obstacle he hadn't quite accounted for. My wife, Nathaniel said, quieter now but no less firm, used to tell me that judging a person before you'd taken the trouble to know them was the laziest kind of cruelty there was. I've spent 3 years missing her wisdom more than I can say. I'm not about to start ignoring it now, on account of somebody's convenient footprints in the mud. He looked around the room at faces that had gone, from certain to uncertain, at a fear that had, for just a moment, lost some of its momentum. Somebody in this county wants Freya Lindqvist gone, he said. I don't yet know why, but I intend to find out. And when I do, I expect this room will owe her an apology a good deal larger than the one it's currently considering handing her instead. The meeting broke apart. After that, uncertain, unresolved, the fear not fully dispelled, but at least, for the moment, checked. Nathaniel rode home in the dark feeling like he'd bought Freya a reprieve rather than a victory. Whitfield hadn't spoken a single word the whole meeting, hadn't needed to. He'd simply watched and calculated, and left with whatever he'd come to learn already learned. Nathaniel didn't know, riding home that night, that the reprieve wouldn't hold. Because 2 days later, someone slipped a note under Freya's door at Mrs. Halloran's boarding house, and signed, cruel in the particular, careful way that cowards manage cruelty, not threatening violence outright, just making very clear that her welcome in Wheatridge Junction had an expiration date, and that expiration date was approaching fast. Freya didn't show Nathaniel the note, didn't tell him about it at all that Friday, though he noticed he was getting better at noticing these past 2 months that something in her had gone quiet in a way that worried him more than any of her earlier fierceness had. You're not yourself, he said, echoing her own words back to her from weeks before. Long week, she said, which was true and also nowhere near the whole truth, same as his own words had been that other Friday. He didn't push. He'd learned by now that pushing rarely worked with her, that she gave things up in her own time, at her own pace, the way a person does, when trust has been broken enough times to make caution a permanent habit. He didn't know, sitting beside her on that bench, watching the last light fade gold, and then gray, over the tracks, that she'd already made a decision. He didn't know it was the wrong one, made out of love rather than fear, though the two had gotten so tangled in her mind by then that she could barely tell them apart. The letter arrived at the depot the following Tuesday, forwarded from the address of a woman Freya had corresponded with once, years before, after seeing a notice in a paper about a traveling exhibition based out of the East, not the cruel kind, the kind that put people on display like curiosities for a gawking crowd, but something different. A community, the letter explained. A settlement of sorts outside Philadelphia, where people of unusual size, unusual difference, unusual bodies had built a life together, worked together, protected each other, lived without the daily arithmetic of deciding how much of themselves was safe to show a stranger. We would welcome you, the letter said, if you ever wish to join us. There is always room for one more, who understands what it costs, living out there among the ones who never will. Freya read it 3 times in the depot storeroom, alone, after her shift ended, the December dark pressing close against the single window. She thought about the note under her door, about the footprints she knew, though she couldn't prove it, had been planted by somebody who wanted her gone badly enough to fake evidence toward it. About Nathaniel standing up in that church hall, defending her in front of a room full of people who'd already half decided against her, and about what it would cost him, long-term, to keep doing that. A respected rancher, a grieving widower the whole county had spent 3 years protecting, spending his hard ones standing on a woman the town had decided to fear. She thought about the ranch, about the note coming due in April, the sickness still moving through his herd, the fight with Whitfield over the deed that would need every ounce of goodwill Nathaniel had left in this county, if he hoped to win it. and she thought, with the particular aching clarity of someone who'd learned over and over across multiple towns and multiple failed attempts at belonging, that love sometimes meant leaving, before you became the reason someone else lost everything, that staying might cost him more than she was willing to let it cost. She wrote back that same night, accepted the position, told them she'd arrive within the month. She didn't tell Nathaniel. Not that week. Not the week after. She told herself she'd tell him eventually. Told herself there'd be a right moment, a right way to say it that wouldn't feel like abandonment, wouldn't feel like exactly the thing she was trying so hard not to become, another loss stacked on top of the losses he'd already carried 3 years too long. She was wrong about that, the way people usually are, when they convince themselves a clean exit exists for something this messy. January brought more losses to the herd, 19 head by the middle of the month, the sickness finally slowing, but not before it had carved a serious hole in what Nathaniel had to work with come spring. He spent most of his days now in a grim, practical fog of arithmetic, trying to find some combination of numbers that let him keep the ranch, keep the note covered, keep everything his father, and then he and Adeline together had built from sliding into Jonas Whitfield's patient, waiting hands. He didn't notice, at first, that Freya had grown quieter. Distracted, that her Friday visits, while still warm, carried an undertow he couldn't quite name. He noticed it properly on the third Friday of January, when she actually flinched at something as small as him mentioning offhand how nice it would become spring to finally introduce her properly to the ranch, to show her the house. The kitchen Adeline had organized. The garden that would, come April, start showing the first green shoots of things Adeline had planted years ago, and that still, faithfully, came back every year on their own. Spring, Freya repeated, something careful in her voice. April, maybe? Nathaniel said, not noticing yet, still caught up in his own small warmth at the thought. Once the frost breaks properly, I'd like you to see it. The garden especially. It was hers. Still is, I suppose. But I think you'd understand it. The way she planted things that came back on their own. Things built to last past a single season. Freya didn't answer right away. Nathaniel, she said finally, I need to tell you something. Something in her voice made his chest go tight, before she'd said another word. I received a letter, she said, some weeks back, from a community back east. People like me, built like me, a place where I wouldn't have to explain myself every single day just to walk down a street, without somebody deciding what I must be capable of based on my shoulders and my height. Nathaniel felt the ground shift under him, slow and terrible, the way it does right before something you love gets taken. And I wrote back, Freya said, and her voice was very steady now, the particular steadiness of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will. I accepted. I meant to leave by the end of the month. The silence that followed felt very long. You didn't tell me, Nathaniel said finally, quiet, not angry exactly, something worse than angry, something that sounded like a man watching a door close, that he hadn't known was open. I was going to. When? I don't know, Freya admitted. I kept looking for the moment that wouldn't feel like this. Like I was choosing to leave you the way everyone I've ever loved has left me. Except I couldn't find that moment because I don't think it exists. There's no way to say this that doesn't sound like exactly what it is. Then don't go, Nathaniel said. Simple. Direct. The most honest thing he'd said all winter. Nathaniel. I mean it. Don't go. Stay. Fight this with me instead of running from it. It's not about running, Freya said, and now her own voice was cracking, the careful steadiness finally starting to give. It's about you, about what it costs you, standing up for me in that church hall, spending everything you've built here defending a woman half this county has already decided to fear. You've got a note coming due, a fight over your wife's land ahead of you, a whole winter's worth of losses to recover from. You don't need my trouble stacked on top of your own. That's not your decision to make for me. Maybe not, Freya said, but it's mine to make for myself, and I've made it. She didn't tell him the exact day, told herself in the last cowardly corner of her resolve that a clean break would be kinder for both of them, No drawn-out goodbye, no scene at the depot, just an absence he'd discover on some ordinary Friday, and eventually, in time, understand. She was wrong about that too. She packed her single trunk on the last Thursday of January, said her careful goodbyes to Mrs. Halloran, who watched her go with an expression that suggested she understood a great deal more than she was letting on. She arranged for the eastbound the following morning, Friday morning, the last Friday of January, though not the Friday afternoon train Nathaniel always waited for, an earlier one deliberately so she'd be gone before he even rode into town. She told herself this was mercy, told herself, packing her trunk in the gray pre-dawn light, that she was doing the harder, better thing, leaving before she became one more loss stacked on a man who'd already carried 3 years' worth. She didn't examine too closely whether that reasoning held up to any real scrutiny. She'd learned, across enough towns and enough departures, that scrutiny was a luxury she couldn't afford, when the leaving already hurt this much. She arrived at the depot at 3:30, that Friday morning, no afternoon, she corrected herself, checking the small watch she'd inherited from her mother, one of the only things she'd carried west, with her, early enough that the platform stood nearly empty, the winter cold biting sharp through her coat. She set her trunk down, bought her own ticket this time from the substitute clerk who'd finally recovered enough to take back the window, the same window she'd stood behind for 2 months, selling tickets to people going somewhere, while she herself had gone nowhere at all until now. She looked at the second bench from the East End. Empty this early, hours before Nathaniel would arrive for his usual Friday ritual. She thought about sitting there one last time, decided against it. Some things, she'd learned, hurt worse if you let yourself linger in them. She heard the whistle in the distance, the eastbound, coming up the line, right on schedule, the way trains in this county mostly ran. She picked up her trunk, and that was when she heard hoofbeats coming hard down the road into town, fast, urgent. A horse pushed well past its comfortable pace and turned, trunk still in her hands, to see Nathaniel Ashford come tearing into the station yard 6 hours before he was ever supposed to be there, his horse lathered white, his face carrying an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not grief, not this time, something closer to fear. Fear of losing something he hadn't even fully realized, until this exact moment, that he couldn't afford to lose. The train was pulling into the platform behind her. Brakes hissing, steam rolling back. Over the cars the same way it always did. The same coal and creosote smell filling the cold January air. Freya stood there, with her trunk in both hands, caught between the man riding toward her and the train pulling in beside her, and understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, that the clean exit she'd planned had just become the messiest moment of her entire life. The whistle screamed again, closer now, and Freya didn't move. Couldn't move. Trunk still gripped in both hands, knuckles gone white around the handle, watching Nathaniel swing down off his lathered horse, before the animal had even fully stopped. He crossed the platform at something between a walk and a run, which wasn't like him, because Nathaniel Ashford moved deliberate, always every motion considered before it happened. Not this time. You weren't going to tell me, he said. Not a question. Breath still ragged from the ride. I left a letter, Freya said, at Mrs. Halloran's. She was going to give it to you Sunday. A letter. I thought it would be easier. For who? His voice cracked on it just slightly, and she watched him hear himself do it and hate it. Easier for who, Freya? Because it sure as hell wasn't easier for me. I rode into town this morning to check the mail on the off chance the land agent in Salina had sent word about the deed, and Mrs. Halloran was standing on her porch with an envelope in her hand, and a look on her face like she was about to hand me a death notice. Nathaniel. 6 hours, he said. You were going to be gone 6 hours before I even knew to look for you. The train sat hissing behind her, steam rolling back over the cars. The conductor calling something down the platform that neither of them heard clearly enough to register. I did it because I love you, Freya said, and the word landed between them like something dropped from a great height. First time either of them had said it plain. No hedging, no careful almost language. I did it because I've watched you spend your standing in this county defending me. Because I've watched the sickness eat your herd, and Whitfield circle your land like a buzzard waiting on a carcass. And I thought if I was gone, you'd have one less weight to carry. You thought wrong. Did I? Freya. He stepped closer. Close enough now that she had to look up at him despite her height, despite the fact that she'd spent her whole life looking down at nearly everyone she'd ever met. I spent 3 years sitting on that bench missing a woman I couldn't get back no matter what I did, no matter how hard I wished it, no matter how many Fridays I showed up and watched a train empty out and never once saw her face in the crowd. He swallowed, kept going. You're not gone, he said. Not yet, which means this is the one grief in my whole life I actually get a say in. And I am telling you plain, right here on this platform in front of God and the ticket agent and whoever else wants to listen, I don't want to spend the rest of my days missing a woman who could have stayed and chose not to give me the chance to ask her to. The conductor called last boarding. Freya looked at the train, looked at Nathaniel, looked at the trunk still gripped white-knuckled in her own hands, months of careful, practiced leaving compressed into one small brass-cornered box. What if I stay? She said. And it still isn't enough. What if the county never comes around? What if Whitfield wins and you lose the ranch anyway, and all you've got left is a woman half this town still won't look at without flinching? Then we lose it together, Nathaniel said, which is a different thing entirely than losing it alone. I've done losing alone, Freya. I know exactly what that tastes like. I'm not interested in doing it again, if there's another way. The conductor's whistle sounded final, sharp, insistent. Freya set the trunk down, not dropped it. Set it down, deliberate. The same care she gave everything, burlap seams, wildflowers, a man's grief she'd learned to sit beside without flinching. The train pulled away without her. Neither of them watched it go. They stood on the empty platform along, while after, the steam settling, the cold January air sharp around them, and Nathaniel reached out, slow, careful, giving her every chance to step back, if she wanted, and took her hand in both of his. Her hand. The one that had hauled 100-pound feed sack like a shawl. The one that had wrenched a fence rail back into place in a storm dark enough to hide her face. The one that had, apparently, been capable all along of doing the one thing hardest for either of them, staying when leaving would have been so much simpler. I need to tell you something too, he said. About the deed. About Whitfield. I think I know now why he wants that land so badly, and I don't think it's got anything to do with grazing rights. Freya's eyes sharpened, the grief in her face making room, fast, for something else. Something useful. Tell me, she said. Here was what Nathaniel had learned, riding out to the land agent in Salina 3 days before. The letter he hadn't yet shared with anyone because he'd wanted to be certain before he said it out loud. The northeast quarter section, Adeline's land, deeded separate from the rest of the ranch by her father's old-fashioned caution, didn't just border the rail spur. It sat directly over the county's best water source, a spring-fed aquifer, deep and reliable, that half the ranches in this stretch of Kansas drew, from without most of them even knowing exactly where the water originated. Whitfield's bank, it turned out, had spent the better part of a year quietly buying notes on ranches all along, that same water table, not because those ranches were failing on their own, but because Whitfield intended, once he controlled enough of the land above that aquifer, to control the water rights beneath it, charge for access, or deny it outright to whoever refused his terms. He asked about the spring, that day at the ranch, Nathaniel said slowly, the pieces finally settling into place. I thought it was idle talk. It wasn't. A banker doesn't notice water, unless water is exactly what he's after. Nathaniel's land, Adeline's land, sat right at the center of it, the one piece he hadn't yet managed to pry loose. He needs that parcel, Nathaniel said. Needs it bad enough to invent an ambiguity in a deed that doesn't actually exist, bad enough to threaten a foreclosure he'd have to manufacture. Through the courts, bad enough, I'd wager, to plant a set of fake footprints on my land and set the whole county against you because a distracted rancher fighting a scandal and a sickness and a scared town all at once is a rancher too worn down to notice a land grab happening right under his boots. Freya went very still. He used me, she said slowly, as the distraction. I think so, Nathaniel said. I can't prove it yet. Not the footprints. Not the note under your door. But the shape of it fits too well to be coincidence. Then we find the proof, Freya said, steady again, the fear from moments before burning off fast into something with edges. The land agent's already writing to the county recorder in Topeka, Nathaniel said, asking after every note Whitfield's bank has purchased along that water table these past 2 years. If there's a pattern, it'll show up on paper. Paper doesn't lie the way a man standing in your yard can. That could take weeks. It could, Nathaniel agreed. We don't have weeks to spare, most likely, but it's a start, and a start's more than we had yesterday. They didn't get the chance to wait on it slowly, because that same night, the sky opened up in a way even the old-timers hadn't seen in years. Not snow, though it was cold enough for it, but rain, driving and relentless, the kind of warm winter storm that sometimes rolled up from the Gulf and caught a whole county unprepared, melting what little snowpack sat on the higher ground and sending it all downhill at once. By dawn, Coldwater Creek, the modest stream that ran along the edge of town, usually placid enough that children waded it in summer without their mothers worrying, had become something else entirely. Brown and swollen and violent, tearing at its banks, rising by the hour. And the wooden bridge that carried the road across it, the only crossing for 6 miles in either direction, the bridge that connected half the outlying ranches to Wheat Ridge Junction, and the rest of the world was groaning under water that had never been meant to reach that high. Nathaniel heard the church bell ringing the alarm, before he'd even finished his morning chores, 3 short, 3 long, the pattern every rancher in the county had learned meant trouble, real trouble, the kind that needed every able body it could gather. He rode for town at a dead gallop. The scene at the bridge, when he arrived, looked like something out of a nightmare painted in browns and grays. Half the town had gathered on the near bank, shouting, pointing, most of them helpless against water moving too fast, and too high for anyone to safely wade. On the far side, the wrong side, the side the bridge was failing to properly connect anymore, 3 families stood stranded, their wagons and livestock crowded, onto a shrinking spit of high ground, the water rising around them faster than anyone could organize a rescue. The bridge itself groaned again, a sound Nathaniel felt more than heard, deep in his chest, and one of the central support beams, already weakened, he'd learn later, by a decade of deferred county maintenance, that Whitfield's bank had specifically declined to fund. When the matter came up for a loan the previous spring, cracked audibly and dropped several inches into the churning water. It won't hold, someone was shouting. Bridge won't hold another hour, maybe less. And that was when Nathaniel saw her. Freya was already at the water's edge, coat off, sleeves torn back, wading into the flood, without a moment's hesitation, while 3 grown men stood frozen on the bank behind her, shouting warnings she wasn't stopping to hear. Freya! Nathaniel's voice tore out of him, raw, terrified. Freya, wait. She didn't wait. Nathaniel's eye caught something else, too, in that same instant, a flash of movement at the edge of the crowd, near the livery. Jonas Whitfield, already mounted, already turning his horse away, from the bridge and toward the road out of town, moving with the particular haste of a man, who had somewhere else he suddenly needed to be. Not helping, not even watching, leaving. Nathaniel filed it away, the way you file away a thing you don't have time to think about yet, and waded into the flood. She reached the failing support beam in a dozen powerful strides, through water that would have swept a smaller person clean off their feet, and she got both arms under it, the same arms that had hauled feed sacks, hauled fence rails, hauled a drowning man's whole life back from the edge of a stampede, and she held. Just held, braced against the current, against the weight of a bridge groaning to collapse above her, buying time in the only currency she had, raw, unrelenting strength that the whole county had spent months calling unnatural, and that right now, in this exact moment, was the only thing standing between 3 stranded families and a flood that didn't care what anybody thought about the size of the woman fighting it. Get them across, she shouted, water surging chest high around her, voice carrying over the roar. Now, while it holds. Nathaniel didn't hesitate a second longer than it took to understand the order. He waded in behind her, the water shockingly cold, shockingly strong, dragging at his boots like it had opinions about where he belonged, and started directing the stranded families across the weakened span, one at a time, steadying wagon wheels, catching an elderly woman, frail and terrified, half carried the last several yards by a rancher twice her size, as the bridge groaned and shifted and somehow impossibly held. Held because Freya was holding it. Held because she'd planted herself in freezing water up to her chest, and simply refused to let go minute after minute, while the whole county, that had spent 2 months whispering about her, watched instead, in stunned and finally unguarded silence, exactly what she was actually capable of when it mattered. It took the better part of 40 minutes to get everyone across. 40 minutes that felt, to Nathaniel, like the longest of his life, longer than the storm that had broken his fence, longer than any single hour of the 3 years since Adeline died, because every one of those 40 minutes carried the very real possibility that the woman he loved might not survive helping people who, a week before, had been ready to run her out of town on the strength of a lie. The last family made it across just as the beam gave way entirely, a groan, a crack, and then the whole center span dropping several feet all at once into the roiling water, though by then it no longer mattered, because everyone who needed crossing had crossed, and Freya was hauling herself up onto the near bank, soaked through, shaking with cold and exertion both, into arms that had been waiting for her the entire time. "You could have died," Nathaniel said, holding her so tight it must have hurt, not caring, not able to care about anything except the solid, shivering, alive weight of her against him. "So could they," Freya said, teeth chattering. Seemed like a fair trade. The crowd on the bank had gone very quiet. Silas Deer stood near the front of it, soaked from helping haul the last wagon clear, staring at Freya, with an expression Nathaniel had never once seen on his face before. Something like shame, something like a man recalculating, fast and uncomfortably, everything he'd said about a woman who'd just spent 40 minutes holding a collapsing bridge together, with her own 2 arms so that his neighbors wouldn't drown. "Ma'am," he started, and then seemed to run out of whatever he'd meant to say next. He wasn't the only one struggling for words. The whole crowd carried that same stunned, shame-faced quiet, the particular silence of people confronting, all at once, exactly how wrong they'd been, and exactly how much that wrongness had nearly cost. Nathaniel didn't let the quiet sit long. "Whitfield's gone," he said, loud enough to cut through it. "Rode out not 10 minutes ago, while the rest of us were up to our necks in that water. A man with nothing to hide doesn't run from a flood while his neighbors are drowning." The words landed. He could see them land, faces turning, remembering, a few nodding slowly, as they placed the same sight he had. A well-groomed horse pushed hard toward the county road, while half the town waded into danger. "Somebody saddle up," Nathaniel said. "He's not getting far in this weather, with the roads the way they are." They caught him 4 miles east, his horse blown and stumbling in the mud, the road ahead washed out, where a culvert had given way in the night. He hadn't gotten far at all, the storm had seen to that, if nothing else. He didn't run when he saw them coming. There was nowhere left to run to. "Going somewhere, Mr. Whitfield?" Nathaniel asked, reining up beside him, Freya and 2 other ranchers close behind. Whitfield's composure, usually so carefully maintained, had frayed at the edges. "I had business in Topeka, nothing more." "Business that couldn't wait an hour," Nathaniel said, while 3 families were stranded on the wrong side of a flooding creek. "Funny kind of business." "I don't answer to you, Ashford." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "But you'll answer to the county recorder. Once the land agent in Salina finishes tracing every note your bank's bought up along the water table these past 2 years. And you'll answer for a set of footprints pressed into my north pasture by somebody paid to press them there. And you'll answer, I expect, for whatever's in those saddlebags you were in such an all-fired hurry to carry out of town with you." Whitfield's eyes went to his own saddlebags, just for a moment, just long enough to confirm what Nathaniel had guessed. A banker careless enough to keep his own correspondence close instead of trusting it to the mail, now caught 4 miles from town with nowhere left to hide it. "You've no right," Whitfield started. I've every right, Nathaniel said. Sheriff's already been sent for. You can hand those bags over now, calm, or you can wait for him to take them off you the hard way. Either way, Mr. Whitfield, this ends today. Whitfield's shoulders dropped. The practiced pleasantness finally entirely gone. He handed over the bags. The papers inside told the rest of it plainly enough. Correspondence with his associate in Topeka, careless in the way men write, when they never expect their words to be found, laying out the whole scheme in his own hand. The manufactured footprints. The drifter paid to press a false trail into the mud near Ashford's north fence. The deliberate delay of county bridge maintenance funds to keep the crossing weak enough that a hard rain might eventually force a crisis he could then exploit. The full plan for the water rights beneath the northeast quarter, spelled out clear enough that no court in Kansas would need much convincing. That land is worth having, Whitfield said, and something bitter and honest finally showed through the wreckage of his composure. Water rights for half this county. You'd have signed eventually one way or another. Everyone always does in the end. Not everyone, Nathaniel said. Not this time. The sheriff arrived from the county seat 2 days later, once word had traveled, and the letters had been properly examined by men, whose job it was to examine such things, and Jonas Whitfield left Wheat Ridge Junction the same way he'd arrived on a train, though this time in considerably less comfortable company, facing charges that would keep him occupied for a good while longer than he'd ever intended to spend in this particular corner of Kansas. The county, for its part, spent the following weeks doing something it hadn't quite managed in 2 months of careful, cowardly whispering. It apologized. Not all at once. Not gracefully, entirely. Small towns rarely manage grace when they're forced to confront their own cruelty. But Silas Deere came by the depot the following Tuesday, with a sack of the good coffee beans, no charge, and stood there long enough to say, gruffly, that he'd been wrong, and that he hoped Freya would let him say so properly sometime over that coffee if she was willing. She was willing. Freya Lindqvist, it turned out, had a considerably larger capacity for forgiveness than the county had shown any evidence of deserving. Mrs. Halloran, who'd never once doubted her to begin with, simply nodded when Freya told her the news about Whitfield, the way a woman nods when a thing she already suspected is finally proven true, and went back to setting the supper table like nothing more needed saying. The land agent in Salina confirmed, within the week, exactly what Freya had guessed. From the beginning, the deed to the northeast quarter section held no ambiguity at all. Adeline's father had drafted it, with a lawyer's precision, every word accounted for, protecting his daughter's inheritance exactly, as thoroughly as he'd intended. Whitfield's claimed ambiguity had been invention, from the start, one more piece of a scheme built entirely on the assumption that a grieving widower, distracted and desperate, wouldn't have the resources to check. The note at the bank, once the fraudulent purchase came fully to light, was quietly reissued under fair terms by a different institution altogether, one considerably less interested in a rancher's failure than in simply being repaid in time the way honest lending was supposed to work. Nathaniel would keep the ranch. He would keep, too, something he hadn't expected to find again, not replacing what he'd lost, never that, but building alongside it, the way the strongest things always got built. Spring came to Wheat Ridge Junction the way it always came to, that stretch of Kansas abruptly after a winter that had meant every bit of its cruelty, the frost breaking almost overnight into a green, so sudden and complete it seemed like the land itself had been holding its breath right alongside everyone who lived on it. Nathaniel brought Freya out to the ranch on the first truly warm Sunday in April. He'd been putting it off, if he was honest with himself, not from any reluctance about her, never that, but from the particular tenderness a man carries toward the last untouched corners of a life he's still learning to live differently. The house, the kitchen, the garden. She stood in the doorway a long moment before stepping inside, and he watched her take it in, the front room, the small desk, where the ledger still sat, Adeline's careful old handwriting visible on the open page beside his own more recent additions. "This is where you sat," Freya said quietly. "That first night, after the storm, working through the numbers." "How did you know that?" "Because it's the kind of room a person goes to when they need to feel close to someone who isn't there anymore," she said. "I've got a room like it too. Had one anyway, Back before I left everything behind and came west. He showed her the kitchen next. Adeline had organized it with a logic entirely her own, a specific order to the shelves, the jars, the hooks along the wall, built up over years of a marriage where she'd known exactly where everything needed to be so that a tired man coming in from the fields could find what he needed without asking. Nathaniel hadn't changed a single thing about it in 3 years. Not from inability, from the plain understanding that the logic still worked and some things you kept not because you couldn't move past them but because they'd earned the right to stay. Freya walked the length of it slowly, taking it in, her hand trailing along the edge of a shelf built at a height meant for a woman considerably shorter than herself. She had good judgment, Freya said finally, about where things went. About most things, Nathaniel agreed. I'd need to learn it properly, Freya said, before I could help with any of it. I don't want to just override what she built. I want to understand it first. Understand her, as much as a person can, secondhand, through a kitchen, and a garden, and a husband, who still misses her every single day. Nathaniel felt something in his chest go warm and unsteady at that. Not grief this time, something closer to gratitude. That's all I could have hoped you'd say, he told her. He took her out to the garden last. Adeline had planted it their first spring together, 15 years back, kitchen herbs along the south edge, something flowering along the north wall, and in the center, coming up now in the warm April light, the perennials she'd chosen deliberately, the things built to return on their own, year after year, whether or not anyone remembered to plant them fresh. They stood at the garden's edge together, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders, new green pushing up, through soil that had weathered 3 winters without her. I'll need to learn what everything is, Freya said, before I can help tend it properly. I can tell you what I know, Nathaniel said, which isn't all of it. She kept some of her reasoning to herself, I think. Some things a gardener just knows in her hands that don't translate easy into words. That's all right, Freya said. We'll figure out the rest together. They stood there a long while, the Kansas light gold and generous around them, and that, Nathaniel thought, watching Freya crouch to examine a stubborn green shoot pushing up through last year's dead growth, was enough. Not the whole of it, not a replacement for anything, just enough for that particular afternoon, in that particular garden, built by a woman who'd understood, better than most people ever managed, that love worth having was the kind built to outlast a single season. He went back to the bench alone one last time on a Friday in early May. Freya knew he was going. He'd told her the night before, simply, the way he'd learned to tell her things now instead of carrying them silent, and alone the way he'd carried everything for 3 long years, before she arrived. She'd said she'd be waiting after, whenever he was ready, and hadn't asked to come along, understanding, the way she understood most things about grief, having carried her own share of it, that some goodbyes needed exactly one person to complete them. He rode into town, tied his horse at the post. Same knot. He bought his platform ticket. 5 cents. Exact change. He'd stopped at the south fence line on his way in, and found the wildflowers coming up thick and stubborn along the wire, the way they always did once the frost finally broke for good. He carried a small bundle of them now, the last one he'd carry to this particular bench for this particular reason. He sat on the second bench from the east end. The eastbound came in at 4:12, same as it always had. He watched the passengers step down, a man with a case, 2 women deep in conversation, a rancher he half recognized, from 3 counties over, and watched each of them the way he'd watched every passenger for 3 long years, with the patient attention of a man who once knew exactly whose face he was looking for. None of them were Adeline. He didn't expect them to be, not anymore, hadn't truly expected it in longer than he could easily measure. The train pulled away. He sat his last few minutes watching the tracks curve east around the low rise of hill and disappear, the same vanishing point she used to emerge from all those years ago, smoke first, then the black shape of the engine, then her running the last 20 yards because walking was too slow when you'd been sitting still for 3 hours and there was finally something worth moving toward. He thought about her, not the absence of her this time, which was what he'd been sitting with for 3 long years, but the presence of her, which was different, which had, he understood now, been there the whole time, underneath the grief, patient and waiting for him to notice it. She was in the kitchen she'd organized down to the last jar. She was in the garden, that came back every spring whether or not anyone remembered to help it. She was in the particular way he'd learned to show up for people without waiting for a guarantee, because she'd loved him for exactly that quality, and the loving had shaped him into a man capable of doing it again, for someone else when it mattered most. She hadn't left when she died. She'd simply changed form. He took the old platform ticket from his coat, the one he'd carried folded soft at the creases for 3 years, carried through every Friday, every ritual, every silent afternoon of watching trains he already knew wouldn't bring her back. He held it a long moment. Then he set the wildflowers down on the bench beside him. Not the way you set something down to leave it behind. The way you leave something in good hands, trusting it to be tended by whoever comes after. He stood, put his hat on. He walked to the depot window where Freya had finished her shift and stood waiting for him, exactly the way he'd waited for a woman on this platform for 3 long years, except this time the waiting had an answer that was actually coming. She looked at him, looked at the empty bench behind him, the small bundle of wildflowers resting, where he'd left them. She didn't ask about the flowers. He didn't explain them. Some things they'd both learned by now simply were what they were. They married in September on a Saturday because Friday belonged to something else now, not grief anymore, not exactly, but memory, and neither of them wanted to change what Friday had become. The ceremony was small. The whole county turned out anyway, crowding into the little church at the edge of town, and Nathaniel noticed, standing at the front waiting for Freya to appear, that Silas Deer had found a seat in the 3rd row, hat in his lap, looking for all the world like a man determined to make up in attendance what he'd failed in kindness. Mrs. Halloran sat near the front too, watching with the particular satisfaction of a woman who'd known, from the very first Friday, exactly where this was headed. Freya wore a dress the color of the Kansas sky in September, clear, deep blue, the kind of blue that showed up right before the season properly turned. Nathaniel wore his good shirt. The same blue one Adeline had always liked, the one he'd worn every single Friday for 4 years running now, rain or shine, grief or otherwise. He wore it on the day he married again. Freya noticed, said nothing about it, understood, the way she understood most things about him by now, that some things simply were what they were, and that a man carrying love forward didn't need to leave the old love behind to make room for it. After the ceremony, they walked to the depot. No particular reason. No train to meet. No passenger expected. They walked there, because it was where everything had started, a loading dock, 100 pounds of feed sacks, a stranger's steady gray eyes meeting his own for the first time. The platform sat quiet in the September afternoon. The timetable board showed the next eastbound wasn't due for hours yet. The second bench from the east end held nothing now, no flowers, no folded ticket, just gray cedar boards worn smooth by 4 years of a grieving man's careful, faithful visits. Freya sat down on it. Nathaniel sat beside her. They looked out at the tracks together, the way they had so many Fridays before, watching the rails curve east around the low rise of hill and vanish from sight, the September light going gold, and generous the way Kansas light always did, right before it started to fade. She knew, Freya said quietly, didn't she, about you, that you'd show up even without a guarantee. Nathaniel thought about it, about Adeline's voice all those years ago, laughing breathless, telling him the most frightening thing about him was that he was the kind of man who showed up anyway. She knew it from the beginning, he said. And you showed up for me the same way, Freya said. Before you had any guarantee I'd stay. I did, he said. I'd do it again, every time. She put her hand over his there on the bench, and he turned his palm up to hold hers properly. The hand that had hauled feed sacks and fence rails and a collapsing bridge, the hand that had, in the end, chosen to stay instead of leaving the way everyone before him had taught her to expect. The bench was theirs now, not instead of what it had been. In addition to it, built wide enough, it turned out, to hold both kinds of love a person could carry in one lifetime, the kind that came first and taught you how to love it all, and the kind that came after, built on everything the first one left behind. The evening train came, through at last, right on schedule, and neither of them moved to watch it. They didn't need to, anymore. They already had exactly what they'd come for.